Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you real-life accounts of courage, challenges, and the pursuit of justice. Today's story follows Sierra Davis, a woman who finds herself caught in a tense confrontation with a police officer at Los Angeles International Airport. What begins as a moment of racial profiling and intimidation escalates into a powerful lesson about privilege, integrity, and standing up for what's right. Join us as we dive into Sierra's journey and the profound impact her actions had, not only on her own life but on the lives of many others. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story. It was a bright and bustling morning at Los Angeles International Airport. As I moved through the crowd with my usual sense of composure, the hum of activity filled the air, families rushing to their gates, business travelers engrossed in their laptops, and tourists eagerly snapping last-minute photos by the iconic airport signs. For me, this place was more than just a transit hub, it was a part of the rhythm of my life. I had traveled to LA on business, a series of meetings related to Horizon Air's latest expansion project. I'd flown in on a commercial flight this time, despite having the option to take a private jet, something I rarely chose to do anymore. It wasn't about the prestige. It was about staying grounded. About feeling connected to the everyday life of the airport, seeing the world in motion from the perspective of a regular traveler. I walked through the terminal with a sense of quiet pride. I had been raised in a world where money and privilege were never hidden. But I learned from a young age that you had to live with grace, never flaunting your family's status unless absolutely necessary. Today, I had a meeting with an architectural firm at noon to discuss Horizon Air's new lounge expansion plans at LAX. The airline was branching into new markets, and Los Angeles was a crucial hub in the company's global network. It was a significant project, one I was determined to oversee personally. As I made my way through Concourse B, I noticed a small commotion by a nearby security checkpoint. There was a young man, impeccably dressed in a crisp polo shirt, arguing with a TSA agent. He looked distressed, his voice shaky as he tried to explain he had nothing to hide, that he was just a passenger trying to catch his flight for a job interview. But the TSA agent wasn't listening. The bag was being searched with far more scrutiny than usual. I couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. The situation was escalating, and it wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. I've seen my fair share of airport altercations before, miscommunications, maybe a misunderstanding here and there, but this felt different. I decided to hang back and watch for a moment, unsure if I should step in. The officer standing by the security checkpoint caught my eye. His posture was stiff, his arms crossed, observing the scene with an impassive expression. I took out my phone to check for a text from my liaison, Michael Tan, who was a little late due to traffic. The distraction of my phone allowed me to step slightly closer to the situation, trying to gauge what was going on. But that's when it happened. "Ma'am, step aside. This area is off limits unless you're part of the security detail." A sharp voice called from behind me. I turned to find Officer Johnson, standing with his arms folded, glaring at me. His eyes narrowed with disdain as he looked me over, clearly irritated by my presence. I felt a strange tightening in my stomach. I hadn't been aware of stepping too close to any restricted area, but I had certainly seen worse in terms of crowding. I took a step back, trying to remain composed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," I said calmly, offering a polite smile. I was just waiting for my meeting. But Officer Johnson's response was anything but polite. His tone was dripping with disdain. "You people always have an excuse to meddle," he snapped, eyes flashing with a judgment I wasn't prepared for. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You people." The phrase lingered in the air, hanging there with an unpleasant weight. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. His words, crude and accusatory, immediately triggered a deep sense of anger. Yet I knew I couldn't let that anger control me. The heat that rushed to my cheeks didn't escape him. I could feel the blood rising as I tried to process what had just happened. I had dealt with subtle forms of prejudice in my life, but this felt like something more blatant, something ugly. I tried to take a deep breath and diffuse the situation. "I'm not meddling. I'm just waiting for a business meeting. I didn't mean to cause trouble." I kept my voice calm, even though I could feel my heart racing. It was hard to imagine how a simple moment like this could escalate so quickly. But Officer Johnson wasn't done. "Sure, next time, mind your own business," he sneered, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. His words were meant to humiliate, to put me in my place. And it worked. I could feel my stomach churn with the unjustness of it all. But I couldn't let it show. I glanced at my watch. I had an important meeting to attend. And I didn't have time for this confrontation. I turned to leave, but his next words stopped me in my tracks. "Walk away with an attitude if you want. But don't make trouble, or you'll be in cuffs faster than you can say, lawsuit." My body tensed. It was a threat, a clear and unambiguous one. And yet, it felt so hollow coming from someone who was supposed to uphold the law. Something in me snapped. I had to do something about this. As much as I wanted to turn away and forget the encounter. His words kept replaying in my mind. My chest tightened, and my pulse raced. I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the way people like me were treated in the world. Those who had always been told to stay silent. To keep their heads down. To avoid making a scene. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I pulled out my phone. My hands trembling slightly. And I dialed my father's direct line. His voice came through almost immediately. "Sierra, are you all right?" I quickly explained the situation. The encounter with Officer Johnson, and how he had threatened me. My voice trembled with a mix of anger and humiliation. My father listened patiently, as always. When I finished, he didn't say much. He simply asked, "Where are you?" "Concourse B. I'm near the sandwich place." "Stay where you are. I'll handle this." I could feel the tension start to lift as I heard the calmness in his voice. My father's presence had always been my anchor. But now, it was more than just comfort, it was power. His influence was the kind that could change everything. And I knew Officer Johnson wouldn't stand a chance. The moment I mentioned who my father was, everything shifted. As I waited for him to handle the situation, I couldn't help but reflect on the larger picture. This wasn't just about one officer's prejudice. It was about the system. About power and privilege, and how it could be used to silence the voices of those who had no other means to fight back. But in that moment, I knew I wasn't going to be one of those silent voices. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a battle for dignity. For respect. And for the right to be treated fairly. No matter who you were or where you came from. And so, I stood there in the midst of the airport crowd. Surrounded by strangers. Yet feeling more isolated than ever. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't just a passenger anymore. I wasn't just someone trying to get to my next meeting. I was a woman who had been wronged. And I wasn't going to let that go unnoticed. Not today. Not ever again. It wasn't long before my father's voice rang through my phone again. He was calm. Yet there was an unmistakable sharpness in his tone that made it clear this situation was far from over. "Sierra, stay right where you are. I've already made a few calls," he said, his voice steady, the power of his position quietly radiating through each word. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. As I stood in the bustling terminal, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on me. My emotions were in turmoil, anger still simmering, but now laced with a growing sense of embarrassment. I had never thought that something so trivial, something so small in the grand scheme of things, would have such an impact. The officer's words, "You people always have an excuse," echoed in my mind, growing louder with every passing second. The sting of his sneer, the quickness with which he tried to strip away my dignity, all left me shaken. How could someone so dismissive, so callous, be in a position of power? I tried to shake off the unease that had settled deep in my chest. I had work to do, a business to run, and a legacy to carry on. Yet, I couldn't simply ignore the incident. I couldn't let it slide. Not this time. This wasn't a small misunderstanding. This was a microcosm of something far larger. Something that couldn't be brushed under the rug. My father had always taught me that when you stand up for what's right, you don't back down. And I wasn't about to start now. But as I settled into the quiet of the waiting area, trying to collect my thoughts, I saw Officer Johnson again. His shadow seemed to loom larger. This time accompanied by another officer. His demeanor was different, though, more insistent. more aggressive. It was as if he hadn't been properly reprimanded at all. I watched as they moved through the crowd, their gaze scanning the tables and the people. And then, as if the universe were conspiring to test me, I caught the eye of Officer Johnson again. His eyes locked onto mine, a look of arrogance still etched on his face. "Ma'am," he called out, his tone dripping with false civility. "I'd like to have a word with you." The tension in my body flared up instantly. But I kept my face neutral. I didn't want to make this any worse. I had already dealt with his attitude once. And now, I felt my patience beginning to wear thin. I set down my drink and stood up, forcing myself to stay composed. "Yes, officer?" I asked, my voice steady, though my insides were anything but. "Security cameras flagged you near a restricted area earlier," he said, crossing his arms and raising an eyebrow as if I were some kind of criminal. "Can you explain why you were there?" I took a deep breath. He was doing this again, wasn't he? Accusing me without cause. "I was with my liaison from Horizon Air," I explained calmly, "and we had permission to be in that area." The guard at the lounge recognized me. Officer Johnson's lips twisted into a smirk. "I guess we'll see about that," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Word is, you were snooping around. Now, unless you can prove it immediately, I'll have to ask you to come with us for questioning." I could feel the weight of his words, his presence, bearing down on me. Around us, people paused their conversations, their eyes drifting toward us. Sensing the tension in the air, I felt a flush of heat rise to my cheeks. But I kept my tone measured. "I have clearance from the airline," I said firmly, "and I was doing nothing wrong. This accusation is baseless." The officer's gaze never wavered. No ID was scanned. He muttered, casting a glance toward his colleague. "It's suspicious." His partner, Officer Leroy, cleared his throat, as though unsure of how to proceed. "We can check with the lounge guard. Verify with her liaison," he suggested quietly, trying to de-escalate the situation. But Johnson wasn't having it. "No, Leroy, we're taking her in," he said flatly, his voice final. My heart pounded in my chest. And for the first time in my life, I realized how quickly a moment could spiral out of control. I wasn't just being inconvenienced, I was being threatened. Threatened with something I had never imagined could happen to me. Not over something as trivial as a misunderstanding. I took another deep breath, my fingers wrapping around my phone. "I'm not going anywhere without cause," I said firmly, "but I'll tell you what, if you want proof of my business here, I'll call my father. He owns Horizon Air." I could see the immediate shift in Officer Johnson's posture. For a brief moment, the smug expression faltered. He looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "Oh, your daddy owns an airline. Huh?" he sneered. "How convenient." But I didn't care. The words he had just spoken had no weight anymore. I dialed my father's direct line, my hand trembling slightly, and brought the phone to my ear. The dial tone was painfully loud in the silence of the terminal. But when my father's calm voice came through, I felt a brief surge of relief. "Dad, I'm at LAX. And this officer is accusing me of trespassing. He's threatening to take me in, even though I had clearance. Can you help me?" My father didn't hesitate. His voice was steady as he asked where I was. And when I told him I was near the lounge, he promised to handle it. I knew, with that single phone call, everything would change. The officer who had treated me with such disdain would soon realize just who he was messing with. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about something far larger. It was about the power of standing up for what's right, even when the world tries to push you back into silence. It was about knowing that some battles, no matter how small they may seem, needed to be fought. And I wasn't going to let fear or humiliation win. Not today. Not ever again. I didn't have to wait long before my father's presence was felt. His calm, collected voice over the phone had already started to shift the entire dynamic of the situation. As I stood there, surrounded by people who were more interested in their own business than what was happening to me, I noticed a subtle change in the air around me. The tension seemed to ease. Not because the situation had resolved itself, but because I was no longer standing alone. The knowledge that my father was involved, that the person in charge of Horizon Air was on the case. Had already begun to influence how others saw me. I wasn't just another passenger anymore. I wasn't just someone they could dismiss. I was someone important. Still, the events of the past few minutes had left a mark. I could still feel Officer Johnson's eyes on me, watching with the same scornful expression he had worn when we first crossed paths. There was a part of me, buried deep down, that wanted to show him just how much power my father's name carried. There was another part of me, however, that resisted that urge. This wasn't about power, it was about right and wrong. About standing up for myself. About showing the world that even the smallest voice could make a difference. Don't back down, my father had always told me. When you must fight, fight with integrity, but pick your battles wisely. This wasn't a battle I had chosen. It was one that had been forced upon me. Minutes passed slowly as I continued to stand there. The quiet hum of the airport wrapping itself around me. I watched the crowds rush past, feeling like I was in a world of my own, isolated from the noise of the terminal. I had half expected Officer Johnson to come back and say something else. But instead, he seemed to retreat, shifting his focus elsewhere. Maybe he was trying to save face. Or maybe he had a moment of realization about what was going on. Either way, he wasn't approaching me again, not yet. And then, as promised, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I didn't need to look at the caller ID to know it was my father. Dad? I answered immediately. Where are you? His voice was still calm. But there was a subtle edge that told me this situation was far from over. Still at the lounge, Concourse B, but I think the officer has backed off for now. I said, glancing over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being watched. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Don't engage with him anymore. Just stay put. His tone was firm but reassuring. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Okay, Dad, I'll wait here. Hanging up the phone, I suddenly felt more visible than ever. The weight of the conversation I had just had with my father, knowing that his influence was now in the equation, had set me apart from the crowd in a way that I wasn't sure I was entirely comfortable with. For all of my desire to stay grounded and independent, I had to admit that the security of knowing my father was there, pulling the strings behind the scenes, made everything feel a little more manageable. Still, the thought gnawed at me, the thought that it wasn't just my father's name that was shifting this situation. It was the power of identity, of who I was and who people assumed I was. In that moment, I realized something important. If I had been anyone else, if I had not had the privilege of my father's name and reputation, this encounter might have ended much differently. That was a truth that unsettled me deeply. How many people, without the connections I had been harassed by officers like Johnson and had no one to turn to? How many had been left to fight battles alone? The thought lingered with me as I stood there, waiting. I wasn't just waiting for my father. I was waiting for the moment when I could do something more. Something larger than just protecting myself from this officer's prejudice. I had a responsibility now. I had the power, through my father's name, through my voice, to make sure this didn't happen to someone else. To be the one who stood up. Not just for myself, but for all the people who were still silenced. In that moment, I wasn't just Sierra Davis, daughter of a powerful man. I was Sierra Davis, someone who refused to accept the world as it was. And that realization gave me the strength to face whatever came next. No matter how uncomfortable it might be. It didn't take long for my father to arrive. When he did, it was as though the entire atmosphere around me changed. He moved through the terminal with quiet authority, his presence undeniable, and when he approached, even Officer Johnson's stance shifted. I noticed it immediately, the way his posture tightened, his arrogant confidence replaced by a hint of unease. You're the one who's been causing all this trouble? Officer Johnson muttered under his breath as my father walked toward us. His words were clipped, but I could see the edge of discomfort beneath his bravado. Yes, I am, my father said, his voice calm, yet unwavering, and I don't appreciate how my daughter has been treated here today. I felt a strange comfort in my father's voice. It wasn't the kind of comfort you get when someone reassures you everything will be fine. No, this was the kind of comfort that came from knowing you were about to see justice served, knowing the person who had the power to make things right was on your side. Officer Johnson took a step back, visibly retreating, though his eyes remained fixed on my father. I was just doing my job, he muttered, though it was clear that he had no intention of backing up his earlier threats. You were doing your job? My father's voice didn't rise, but the force behind it was undeniable. Threatening my daughter with arrest without cause? You've got no business accusing her like that, and I will make sure this gets the attention it deserves. I watched as the officer shifted uncomfortably, casting a glance at his partner, Officer Leroy, who stood awkwardly to the side. Officer Leroy looked at the ground, as though he wanted no part in this exchange. It was clear he wasn't entirely comfortable with what had unfolded, and for the first time, I noticed a faint trace of regret in his eyes. Look, we'll clear this up, Officer Leroy said, his voice tentative. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? I repeated, my voice firm despite the storm of emotions brewing inside me. Let me make it clear, this was no misunderstanding. Officer Johnson here didn't just ask me to step aside. He insulted me, threatened me, and tried to intimidate me. If it hadn't been for my father's name, I wouldn't be standing here today. I'd be in a police station with no way to prove my innocence. My father's hand landed gently on my shoulder, and I took a deep breath, grounding myself. This was the moment when I realized how much of the world still operated on the perception of power. Not on facts, not on fairness, but on whose name you carried, whose backing you had, and whose authority you could summon. Officer Johnson didn't say anything. He seemed to shrink under my father's gaze, as though the weight of the conversation had begun to sink in. But the moment wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. We're going to address this properly, my father continued, his tone hardening just enough to show the officer that this was no idle threat. You're going to answer for your actions. And you're going to learn that this behavior is unacceptable. No one, not even an officer, gets to treat someone like that. My mind began to process everything, how the system had worked in this moment. How Officer Johnson was protected by his badge. And how my father's influence had flipped the script. I thought about all the people who hadn't had someone like him on their side. Who hadn't had the privilege of a powerful name to call on in their moment of need. How many had faced far worse, only to be swept under the rug because they lacked the connections to make their voices heard? I pushed those thoughts aside. Today, I was standing here. Today, I had the power to make this moment count, not just for me, but for others who might be in the same situation. The wheels were already in motion, and I wasn't about to back down. My father, for all his quiet strength, had a way of making sure things were dealt with properly, and in this case, that meant ensuring that Officer Johnson would face the consequences of his actions. But it also meant that we had to do more than just deal with this officer. We had to look at the bigger picture, the systemic issues that allowed people like Johnson to act with impunity. We had to address the biases, the prejudices, the assumptions that people made based on your skin color, your name, your status. We had to push for change, for training, for accountability at every level. And it was in that moment, as I stood there with my father, that I realized this wasn't just about me. This was about every person who had ever been unfairly judged. Every person who had been threatened or belittled simply because of who they were. My father might have been able to get me out of this situation today. But the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. We were going to make sure that Officer Johnson, and anyone else who thought they could act with impunity, knew that there were consequences for their actions. And we weren't going to stop until we made sure the system worked for everyone. As the days went by, the ripple effects of the incident with Officer Johnson began to make their way through the system. My father's influence ensured that the situation was handled swiftly, and Officer Johnson was placed under investigation. But beyond the immediate consequences, something far more profound had changed. The conversation had shifted. What had once been a private matter now became a public call for accountability and change. Through the media, the story of what happened at the airport began to reach far beyond just our personal experience. It sparked a larger discussion about racial profiling, the abuse of authority, and the systemic issues that allowed such behaviors to persist unchecked. People reached out to me, sharing their own stories of similar encounters, of moments when they had been belittled or mistreated. but never had the courage or the means to fight back. It was humbling, but also heartbreaking to hear. The incident led to concrete changes. Not just for me, but for others. Horizon Air took steps to partner with the airport in implementing diversity training and conflict de-escalation workshops. We were working toward creating a better environment for everyone, not just the privileged few. While the pain of that day would stay with me, it had also transformed into something much more powerful, an opportunity to help create a world where people of all backgrounds were treated equally and with respect. It was a long road ahead, but I was committed to walking it, knowing that real change often came with struggle. If Sierra's courageous stand inspired you, please like and share this story, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories that spark hope and positive change.